The living room of the Finch family home in the mountain town of Pine Creek, Oregon, was warm and filled with the scent of pine wood burning in the fireplace. Rose sat at the center of the sofa, wearing a bright yellow dress that caught the afternoon light, showing off the sparkling engagement ring that Edward had placed on her finger just an hour before. Mrs. Finch was busy pouring coffee from a heavy silver pot, her face bright with the excitement of a mother who had successfully secured a wealthy match for her prettiest daughter. Edward sat next to Rose, smiling with the slow comfort of a man who knew he had done exactly what was expected of him by his family and the town. In the corner by the large oak bookshelf, Hazel sat quiet and still, holding a wooden embroidery hoop in her lap, as her needle moved through a piece of white linen. She was 22 years old, with quiet gray eyes and plain brown hair that was always tied back neatly, making her blend easily into the dark wood patterns of the room. She did not speak, and she did not look up from her work, because she had spent most of her life understanding that her role was to remain in the background while her sister occupied the light. The regular rhythm of the afternoon broke when the front door opened without a knock, letting a blast of cold mountain air sweep through the warm hallway and into the living room. The family looked up in surprise as a tall man stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space and causing the lively chatter to die out instantly. It was Frederick, the master of the vast timberlands that covered the upper ridges of the valley, a man whom the townspeople whispered about in quiet voices because he had lived in the massive stone house on the mountain for as long as anyone could remember, without ever aging a single day. He had short white hair that looked like fresh winter frost, and his skin was as pale as smooth marble, contrasting sharply with the dark woolen traveling coat he wore. He held his leather gloves in his left hand and stood near the doorway, his clear eyes sweeping over the room until they bypassed Rose completely and locked onto the quiet corner where Hazel sat with her sewing. He did not ask for a seat, and he did not accept the cup of coffee that Mrs. Finch offered with a trembling hand, but instead delivered his demand with a calm voice that cut through the silence. Frederick stated clearly that he wanted the daughter no one noticed, the one who sat in the shadow of the room while the rest of the family celebrated the upcoming wedding. The words caused Mrs. Finch to drop her silver spoon into the saucer with a sharp clink that sounded like a small disaster in the quiet room, her face going pale as she stared at the white-haired man. Rose gasped loudly and pressed her hand against her neck, her bright yellow dress suddenly looking too loud for the cold atmosphere that had filled the space. Edward blinked slowly, looking back and forth between the pale stranger and the mother, his regular comfort completely shattered by the sudden disruption of their family plans. Hazel kept her hands perfectly steady, holding her needle mid-stitch above the linen fabric, without shaking or showing any sign of panic. She looked up from her sewing and met the gaze of the Vampire King for the first time, her gray eyes reflecting none of the fear that had gripped the rest of her family. Frederick looked down at Hazel with the close attention of a businessman reviewing a contract that he had previously set aside but was now choosing to sign. He explained that he was fully aware of the arrangement between Rose and Edward, and he had no desire to contest or disrupt their upcoming marriage in the town. He stated plainly that he was here for the other daughter, the one who spent her days managing the household bills and keeping the property running while her sister visited the shops. Rose looked at Hazel with a mixture of confusion and intense relief, glad to be spared from the attention of the strange man from the mountains, but furious that her special afternoon had been ruined. Hazel set her embroidery hoop down on the small side table with the same careful precision she applied to all her daily tasks, ensuring it was placed exactly where it belonged, without making a sound. She stood up from her chair and faced the white-haired master of the ridge, refusing to make herself look smaller or afraid in front of him. Hazel asked him directly what he meant by the word want, her voice low and steady, without any of the dramatic fear that her mother expected her to show. She was a woman accustomed to clear definitions and practical matters, having spent her youth balancing the family checkbooks and ordering the winter supplies while others went to dances. Frederick crossed his arms and explained that he required a legal arrangement, a marriage contract that would bring her to the Ridge House as its mistress. He told her that his business interests were connected to her late father's estate, and he needed a wife who could manage the large mountain house without requiring constant supervision or guidance from him. He had been informed by the family lawyer that Hazel was the person who actually kept the household functional during her father's long illness, making her the most capable choice for the task. Mrs. Finch made a small choking sound in her throat, but did not offer any word of denial, knowing that the lawyer's assessment of her youngest daughter was entirely accurate. Hazel looked at the white-haired man steadily, her expression showing no sign of hope or fear or false pride as she considered his unusual offer. She asked him what he brought to this arrangement beyond his wealthy title and his large stone house in the upper forests of the mountain. The assembled aunts who were sitting near the window inhaled sharply at her boldness, shocked that a plain girl would question the most powerful landowner in the region. Frederick remained quiet for a short moment, his pale face showing a flicker of genuine interest as he realized she was not looking for romantic speeches or empty promises. He asked her what she required from him, and Hazel stated that she needed a clear understanding of her duties and his expectations before she would agree to sign any contract. The formal engagement was announced to the town within 2 weeks, causing a wave of gossip to spread through the valleys of Pine Creek about the quiet Finch girl moving to the mountain. Rose retreated to her bedroom for 3 full days after the visitor left, refusing to come down for meals, and then spent the next fortnight in complete silence, refusing to speak to Hazel at all. Mrs. Finch hosted a small dinner for their close neighbors to mark the occasion, but she spent the entire evening talking about Rose's upcoming connection to Edward, reminding everyone that it was the expected match for the family. Hazel said very little during the dinner, focusing her energy instead on preparing her trunks and studying the layout of the mountain roads she would soon be traveling. She had spent her whole life being overlooked by the people in town, which had allowed her to develop the useful habit of watching everything around her with absolute clarity. Hazel spent her final days in the valley, visiting the local stores to settle the remaining family accounts and purchase a few durable items for her new life in the high forests. She bought a thick leather notebook, 2 bottles of black ink, and several warm woolen shawls that could withstand the biting cold of the mountain winter. She did not waste her small allowance on lace or expensive silk dresses, knowing that the Ridge House was located in a remote area where utility was far more important than fashion. The townspeople watched her as she walked down the gravel streets, whispering behind their hands about the quiet girl who was going to live with the white-haired king who ruled the timberlands. Hazel ignored the whispers completely, keeping her posture straight and her mind focused on the practical reality of the work that was waiting for her up the trail. The journey to the Ridge House took place in late November, inside a heavy black carriage that bounced slowly along the winding mountain roads surrounded by tall fir trees. The sky above the peaks was the color of old pewter, and a thick gray mist hung low over the valley floor, swallowing the tops of the pine trees as the horses pulled the carriage higher. Hazel looked out the small glass window, watching her own breath create a soft fog on the surface, as she watched the wild landscape shift from rolling hills to steep stone cliffs. She did not feel any regret about leaving the small town behind, because she knew that she had never truly belonged in the bright social circles that her mother and sister loved so much. She felt a sense of quiet calm as the carriage turned onto the long private driveway bordered by massive elm trees that had dropped all their leaves for the winter. The Ridge House appeared through the forest mist like an old fortress built directly into the side of the mountain, its dark gray stones looking solid and permanent against the wild trees. It had 4 massive stone chimneys that rose into the cold air, and its wide windows caught the weak winter light, without reflecting any warmth back into the yard. Hazel looked at the massive building for a long moment before the carriage stopped, noting with her quick eyes that the mortar along the eastern wing was starting to crumble, and would need repair before the heavy snow arrived. The carriage driver opened the heavy wooden door, and Hazel stepped down onto the wet gravel without waiting for assistance, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She was met at the front porch by Mrs. Weaver, the head housekeeper who had managed the domestic staff at the estate for 21 years without ever losing her stern expression. Mrs. Weaver observed Hazel's quiet arrival with a sharp eye, her face showing the careful evaluation of a servant who had seen many guests come and go over the decades. Hazel did not wait for a formal greeting, but instead extended her bare hand to the older woman and asked immediately to see the household account books and the winter fuel records. Mrs. Weaver's strict expression shifted by a single degree, which was the equivalent of a warm welcome on her usually frozen face, as she realized the new mistress was focused on work. The housekeeper led Hazel through the massive front doors into the main hall, where the air smelled of old beeswax polish, cold wood smoke from the dark hearths, and the damp scent of rooms that had been locked away for the autumn. Hazel walked through the vast space with a steady pace, refusing to be intimidated by the high ceilings or the dark cedar beams that spanned the roof. Frederick was not at the estate when she arrived, having left a message explaining that he was occupied with a timber dispute in the upper valley and would return in 3 days. Hazel used those 3 days to walk through every single room in the Ridge house, carrying her leather notebook in her pocket and making detailed notes on the state of the property. She discovered that the kitchen staff was small and disorganized, the pantry was missing several essential winter items, and the roof had a slow leak near the fourth window of the eastern wing. She moved methodically from the basement to the attic, lighting the oil lamps herself when the young footmen were busy with other chores. On the second morning, she discovered the library, which was a massive 3-story room with a wrought iron railing along the upper walkways and thousands of leather books covering the walls. By the third evening of her stay at the estate, Hazel had spoken to every member of the household staff, identified 3 major maintenance problems, and authorized a local carpenter to fix a rotting window frame. She did not wait for Frederick's permission because she knew the winter storms would arrive soon, and she used the household fund to pay the bill directly. She spent her nights sitting at the large desk in the private study, reading through the confusing financial records left behind by the previous estate manager who had left 2 months earlier. She was deeply engrossed in a column of numbers under the light of a single brass lamp when she heard a soft rustle at the doorway and looked up without startling. Frederick stood in the entrance, wearing his heavy traveling coat and holding his leather gloves, his white hair slightly damp from the mountain fog outside. Frederick stood perfectly still in the shadow of the doorway, looking at Hazel as if she were a mysterious code written in a language he had forgotten how to read. He noted that she had not waited for his arrival before taking charge of the house and altering the maintenance schedules of the workmen. Hazel looked at him steadily from her seat at the desk, explaining that the eastern wing had a leak that required immediate attention from a mason, and she had already arranged for the work to begin. She added that if he preferred her to remain idle and allow the water to ruin the cedar walls, she was prepared to listen to his reasons. Frederick crossed the room into the lamplight, picked up the account transfer paper she had prepared, and read every line with close attention before signing his name at the bottom without a word. Frederick remained standing at the edge of the desk, his pale hands resting on the dark wood as he looked down at the open ledger books spread out between them. He asked her if she had noticed the mistakes in the columns, which had been calculated by the previous manager during the spring season. Hazel pointed to 2 separate entries with her finger, showing him where the numbers did not match the actual grain supplies stored in the barn. She explained that the manager had been hiding the discrepancies for nearly 9 years, which was likely why the previous staff had never caught the problem. Frederick was silent for a few seconds, his pale face showing no sign of emotion, before he bid her good night and addressed her as his wife for the first time since their meeting. The winter months brought heavy snow to the mountain ridges, blocking the trails down to Pine Creek and locking the Ridge house in a world of white silence. Hazel established a strict daily routine that kept her busy from dawn until dark, ensuring that the fires were kept burning and the servants were properly supplied. She learned to understand Frederick's unusual habits through quiet observation, rather than asking him direct questions during their quiet days together. She noticed that he never ate human food during breakfast, choosing instead to sit with a small cup of dark liquid while he read the morning papers from the city. He was a man who spoke very little, but he possessed a sharp, dry wit that would appear unexpectedly during their evening meals and vanish before she could even smile. Hazel also discovered that Frederick had read every single volume in the massive library, and his sharp memory allowed him to recall specific passages from books that had been printed over a century ago. Mrs. Weaver mentioned to her one afternoon, while they were counting the linen that Frederick used to be a much happier man before his previous relationship ended badly. The housekeeper explained that a beautiful woman from a wealthy city family had broken her promise to him many years ago, leading him to remove her large portrait from the main gallery wall. The empty wooden hook above the dining room fireplace remained there as a silent reminder of the trust that had been destroyed. Hazel listened to the story without commenting, but she began to understand why the white-haired man had built such thick walls around his life. Frederick had a habit of moving through the stone hallways without making a sound, often standing near the entrance of a room to watch the staff work before making his presence known to them. Hazel caught him doing this twice during the month of January, though she did not let him see that she was surprised by his quiet movements. The first time occurred in the large kitchen, while she was helping the cook roll out pastry dough for the evening pies, her sleeves pushed up and white flour covering her left wrist. Frederick stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, watching her hands move with steady efficiency, before he turned and walked back into the hallway without saying a word. Neither of them ever mentioned the flower on her wrist, and the moment became another quiet understanding between them as the winter continued. The second time Hazel caught him watching her happened in the giant library during a cold afternoon, when the wind was howling against the thick glass windows. She had climbed halfway up the tall wooden ladder to retrieve an old property survey from the top shelf, her fingers searching behind the heavy leather volumes for the document. The old ladder had a tendency to slide along the upper metal rail, unless someone held the base steady against the oak floorboards. As she pulled the paper free, she looked down and saw Frederick standing at the bottom, with his pale hands raised slightly, ready to catch her if the wood slipped. She climbed down the remaining rungs with complete calm, stepped onto the floor, and handed him the document without letting her voice shake. Frederick took the old paper from her hand but did not immediately drop his arms back to his sides, his clear eyes looking down at her face with a strange intensity. He remarked that the wooden ladder had been slipping on that metal track for 11 years without anyone taking the time to fix it properly. Hazel adjusted her woolen shawl and replied that she found it quite ironic that a house full of books would neglect a basic safety repair for over a decade. Frederick promised that he would have the blacksmith fix the rail the following morning, and Hazel thanked him before returning to her desk with the survey. After that afternoon, the distance between them began to shrink in small ways that would have been invisible to an outside observer who did not know them well. Frederick began to spend his evenings sitting in the dining room with her after the plates were cleared, instead of retreating directly to his dark study to work alone. One evening, he asked her to explain exactly how she had uncovered the cheating manager's financial fraud in the old ledger books. Hazel opened her notebook and walked him through the columns, showing him where money had been moved without any matching receipts from the timber merchants. She pointed out that the numbers always stayed perfectly still when a person was looking out for the actual welfare of the property, rather than just trying to protect their own salary. Frederick leaned back in his leather chair and admitted that he had suspected the fraud for a long time, but could never prove it, because the figures always confused him. In the middle of March, the mountain roads began to clear, and Rose arrived at the Ridge House without warning, bringing Edward and a large carriage filled with 6 heavy trunks. She explained that the social season in New York was still 3 weeks away, and she had grown terribly bored at their cousin's country house down in the valley. She claimed she wanted to see the famous stone estate for herself, though Hazel knew her sister actually wanted to see how the plain daughter was managing her new life. Rose was still remarkably beautiful, wearing an expensive fur coat and a dress of bright orange silk that looked out of place against the gray stone walls. Edward spent most of his time visiting the stables and eating large meals, offering no opinions of any consequence about the house. Rose walked through the large rooms of the estate with the restless energy of a woman who was constantly evaluating what she had lost by not choosing the wealthier path. She remarked that the principal living room was much smaller than she had imagined from the stories in town, even though the space was over 40 feet wide. Hazel replied that the room was a very good size for a mountain home, being easy to heat during the long freezing winters. Rose then suggested that the 3-story library must be incredibly cold and uncomfortable during the dark months of the year. Hazel explained that she had recently had the stone fireplace rebuilt on the southern wall, and the room now drew the heat perfectly throughout the entire day. Rose smiled her bright, familiar smile, which had always been her most reliable tool for hiding her true feelings from the people around her. She told Hazel that she had certainly made herself very much at home in the massive stone house, using a tone that suggested she was acting more like a servant than a mistress. Hazel looked her sister directly in the eyes and stated calmly that it was her home, her voice completely free of anger or false pride. Frederick was standing at the far end of the long room during this exchange, holding a glass of juice that he had not tasted, watching them with absolute stillness. He did not say a word to interrupt the sisters, but his clear eyes remained fixed on Hazel's calm face as she turned back to her work. Rose stayed at the mountain estate for a full fortnight, and during that time she managed to disrupt nearly a dozen household routines with her demands. She ordered several expensive cases of wine from a merchant in the city without consulting Hazel, creating a difficult billing dispute that Hazel had to resolve with a single firm letter. She also insisted on rearranging the furniture in the small morning parlor, creating an awkward layout that required the young footman 20 minutes to restore once she left the room. She asked Hazel 3 separate times during dinner whether Frederick found the management of the vast timberlands to be more difficult than he had originally anticipated. On the 3rd occasion, Frederick answered with a single cold word, stating that the work was exactly what he had expected when he took over the property. Frederick did not look at Rose when he delivered his answer, keeping his eyes focused entirely on Hazel, who was quietly helping herself to a piece of bread. On the morning of the 13th day of the visit, Hazel woke up before dawn and went down to the library to read in the quiet hours before the guests came down. She found Frederick already standing by the large glass window, his white hair catching the pale gray light that was rising over the distant mountain peaks. The large room smelled of the cold candle smoke from the night before, mixed with the fresh scent of the herbal tea she had carried up from the kitchen. He did not look startled when she stepped into the room, but turned to face her with an expression she had not seen on his pale face before. Frederick stated plainly that Rose was attempting to demonstrate that Hazel was merely a competent servant who was hired to perform a domestic service for the estate. He added that her sister wanted to make it appear that her life at the Ridge House was just a job, rather than a real partnership that they were building together. Hazel set her book down on the long table and admitted that she was fully aware of what her sister was trying to accomplish with her sharp remarks. She told him that she had no intention of allowing herself to be hurt or insulted by the behavior, because she understood the motivation behind it. She explained that Rose believed she had been passed over for an inferior option when Frederick first came to their family home in town. Hazel explained that she did not blame her sister for having that instinct, because she had always been treated as the lesser daughter in every room they had ever entered together. She stated that she only disliked the petty methods Rose used to express her frustration, rather than the feeling itself. Frederick was quiet for a long moment, setting the book he was holding onto the wide window ledge with that slow, deliberate care that indicated something truly mattered to him. He then began to speak about the beautiful woman whose portrait had been removed from the dining room wall many years ago. He told her that the woman's name was Clara, and she had been considered the most attractive girl in the entire region during their formal engagement. Frederick explained that 14 months after they had agreed to marry, he discovered that Clara was secretly conducting a parallel arrangement with a wealthy landowner from the next county. Clara had informed him of the situation herself, treating it as a perfectly reasonable choice because the other man had a larger immediate income that could support her expensive habits. He paused for a moment, his pale face perfectly still in the gray morning light, before adding that she was only correct in assuming it was an explanation, but wrong to think he would accept it. He told Hazel that after that betrayal, he had made a strict contract with himself to never look for beauty or social charm in a woman again. He stated that he had resolved to find someone whose character could be demonstrated through honest actions, someone who would not break or change under close inspection from the world. He looked at Hazel and told her that she was the first person in a very long time who had bothered to ask what he actually required from a partner. He added that she was also the only person who did not alter her behavior or her language when she believed he was not watching her. Hazel smiled slightly and reminded him that he was nearly always watching her from the shadows anyway, and Frederick admitted that he was, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Outside the library windows, the morning frost was beginning to melt off the dark pine branches as the bright winter sun finally rose over the mountain ridge. The massive house was quiet, save for the distant sound of a door opening in the west wing, where Rose was finally beginning to wake up for breakfast. Hazel and Frederick stood together in the cool air of the room, looking at each other with the particular honesty of two people who had stopped pretending that nothing was happening between them. Frederick told her that he would like to begin their relationship again from the very beginning, leaving behind the cold manner of their first meeting. He admitted that whatever he had implied in her mother's living room was not the full truth of his intentions for their marriage. Hazel asked him to tell her exactly what his true intention had been when he bypassed her sister and chose her instead. He remained quiet for a long moment, selecting his words with the careful precision of a man who never wasted language on empty compliments or false praise. He stated that his intention was to find someone who was completely real, in a massive stone house that had contained very little honesty for many years. Hazel looked at his pale face and his clear eyes, and she told him that she would like for them to be real together, provided he was fully prepared for what that choice would require from both of them. Frederick admitted that he was not entirely certain he knew everything the arrangement would entail, but he was completely prepared to discover it with her. Hazel offered him her bare hand, which still bore a small dark ink stain on the first finger from her work with the ledger books. He took her hand with the same steady care he used when handling his oldest and most precious volumes, holding it without any hurry and giving her his full attention. Rose and Edward departed from the estate the following morning, citing an urgent social engagement that required their presence in the city down the mountain. Rose gave Hazel a brief hug near the carriage doors, remarking that the isolated house seemed to suit her plain personality well enough. Rose added that she still believed the northern guest suite was poorly lit and needed larger windows, but Hazel simply thanked her for the visit and wished her a safe journey. She stood on the front porch and watched the heavy carriage roll down the long avenue until the thick mountain mist swallowed it completely from view. Frederick stood right at her left shoulder, his white hair catching the cold morning breeze as they watched the road clear. He remarked that Rose would likely return to her usual lively self once she reached the bright lights of the city social season. Hazel answered that her sister had always been exactly who she was, and that was the entire point of her behavior. She added that she was no longer angry with her sister because she had too many important things to occupy her time at the estate. Frederick asked if those things included fixing the old wooden ladder that still slipped on its metal track in the library. Hazel laughed softly and told him that the ladder was definitely near the top of her list, along with several other repairs that the house required before spring. By the time the snow fully melted from the valley, they decided to travel down to the main town for the annual spring assembly, marking Hazel's first formal appearance as his wife. She wore a simple dress of cream silk, with her hair styled neatly, wearing a dark silver necklace that had belonged to his family for generations. When they entered the crowded town hall, every person in the room stopped talking to turn and look at the unusual couple standing in the doorway. The local families had spent decades gossiping about the reclusive master of the ridge, and they were stunned to see him accompanied by the quiet Finch daughter who had always been overlooked. Many observers noted that Frederick's usual cold and distant expression had changed into something much warmer as he stood next to his new wife. He remained right by Hazel's side in the crowded room, his pale face looking completely relaxed and comfortable despite the staring eyes of the neighbors. Hazel whispered to him that everyone was watching them, and he asked her if the attention concerned her at all. He added that his only real concern was that the evening would be very long, the music would be terrible, and he would be forced to exchange pleasantries with Edward. He complained that Edward only possessed 3 distinct opinions about horse breeding, and insisted on repeating them at regular intervals throughout the night. Hazel hid her smile behind her hand, and joked that having 3 opinions was actually 2 more than most men in the town could manage. Frederick smiled back at her, offered her his arm, and led her onto the main floor of the hall to join the gathering. The townspeople realized over the course of the evening that Hazel was not the simple girl they had imagined, but a confident woman who held her own. Rose was also present at the spring assembly, wearing a gown of bright burnt orange silk that looked a bit too loud for the soft candlelight of the hall. She watched her sister from across the room, holding her lace fan against her lips, with an expression that Edward later described as highly complicated. Rose did not say a single negative word about Hazel to the neighbors who tried to gossip with her, which Mrs. Weaver later noted was a major sign of personal progress. The gathering ended late in the evening, and Hazel and Frederick returned to their quiet stone house in the mountains, as the rain began to fall. The real transformation of their lives at the estate happened without any grand announcements or dramatic events over the next year. The change came in the form of a long letter from Mrs. Finch, written during the following spring season, acknowledging that the neighbors were all speaking of the Ridge House with genuine admiration. The letter mentioned that the new mortar on the eastern wing had successfully stopped the winter dampness from ruining the old walls. The mother also wrote that the local historical society had noticed the careful work Hazel did to preserve the old stone foundations of the property. She added that a wealthy neighbor had told her that Frederick seemed to be the happiest man in the county these days, which was a remarkable change from his old reputation. Hazel read the long letter twice while sitting in her favorite leather chair in the library, surrounded by the familiar smell of old paper. The large room was completely warm and bright now, thanks to the new stone hearth she had ordered the workmen to build during the autumn months. She placed the letter on the dark wood desk next to her financial ledgers, letting the kind words sink in as she looked out at the green mountains. Frederick found her there a few minutes later, walking into the room without making a sound, but no longer trying to hide his presence from her. He sat down in the chair across from her, a comfortable habit he had formed over the past 12 months of their marriage. He did not ask about the letter from her mother, but told her that the local mason had found another small crack near the back porch. Hazel told him she already knew about the small crack in the stone and had already sent a brief note to the workmen to come fix it on Monday morning. Frederick smiled, his pale face looking brighter than she had ever seen it before during their time together at the estate. He told her that the entire house would probably fall apart if she ever decided to stop managing the accounts and supervising the repairs. Hazel looked at him across the wide wooden desk, feeling a sense of complete satisfaction with the life they had built in the mountains. She told him she had absolutely no intention of stopping her work, and she meant every word as she closed the notebook. The old records of the Ridge House show the steady progress the couple made together over the following years as they managed the vast property. The cheating manager's old debts were fully paid off, the roof was completely sealed against the heavy mountain rain, and the library ladder was finally repaired so it never slipped again. The massive stone house became a warm and welcoming place for the staff and the few guests who traveled up from the valley. The people who had once dismissed Hazel as the plain daughter eventually realized that she and the white-haired king had created something incredibly strong. They built a partnership that lasted because it was based on honesty and steady daily work, rather than empty social show. Hazel stands by the final window of the long gallery, watching the silver moonlight paint patterns across the polished oak floorboards as the night grows quiet. She thinks about the years stretching out ahead of them, long and unhurried like the deep rivers that cut through the Oregon timberlands below the ridge. The old fears of being overlooked or left behind by her family have vanished entirely, replaced by the solid weight of keys in her pocket, and the quiet knowledge that every stone in this house now stands firm because she gave it her attention. It is a strange thing to realize that a life does not need to be loud to be complete, and that the deepest bonds are often grown in the quiet spaces between spoken words, over old accounting books and shared cups of tea in the gray dawn. She looks down at her ink-stained finger and then looks up at Frederick, whose white hair seems to catch every bit of light in the room, standing as he always does, patient and watchful. They have survived the sharp remarks of the world outside and the cold shadows of the past by simply refusing to pretend to be anything other than what they are. The future no longer feels like a map drawn by other people's expectations, but rather a clean ledger waiting for its first entries, solid and dependable. As she reaches out to extinguish the last lamp, she knows that the warmth they have built in this isolated mountain estate will outlast the heavy winter snows and the changing seasons, rooted firmly in the simple choice to remain present, to look at the world with clear eyes, and to build a home together from the foundation up.